When I came back to Chicago, I went to see another immigrant family, a family of a man named Oscar Escher, who owns a Thai restaurant on the northwest side. Mr. Escher's restaurant is on Kedzie Avenue in a storefront on a block that is just a beautiful example of America's immigrant possibility. It's right next door to the Casablanca hair salon, the Arab jewelry outlet, which is next door to a supermercado, which is next door to Marbello's Bakery, next door to the Desayunos Burrito, and the storefront office of Al Muhaseb Bookkeeping, and to Starbucks, of course. Mr. Escher had immigrated to the U.S. in the early 70s, and I'd heard he was a Lincoln fan, although I didn't quite realize how much of a Lincoln fan he was until he took me to the back room of his restaurant where his wife was sitting. She was a very short, beautiful, older Thai woman who spoke no English, but the minute I said the word Lincoln, her eyes just beamed and her whole face brightened. And she couldn't speak English, but she spoke through Mr. Escher, who translated for me, and she told me how she'd come to this affection for Lincoln. She said when she came to the United States, all the license plates that she saw said Land of Lincoln on them. Of course, she'd only been in Illinois. And she said, so he is the head man of your country. And in our country, it's a custom that we pay respect to the person who's in charge of the country. You see Lincoln everywhere, and everyone loves him. So Mr. Escher, in translating her, said, so we realize we must go pay respects to this man. He's a very great man. He helps the poor. He tells everyone that they are equal, that no man is better than any other man. This is very important, she said. Everyone is equal. Everyone have the same right. This is what he says, and he makes sure the country is this way. So for more than 30 years now, the Eschers have taken their children and their grandchildren on a pilgrimage, and there's really no other word for it, to Springfield, to Lincoln's tomb, to pay their respects. They bring flowers, and they sit on the lawn, and they have a picnic, and they pray, and they thank Lincoln for giving them such a wonderful country. As she said to me, we just want to show thanks, and we make sure our children understand Lincoln and be grateful to him for our country and for letting us live here and bringing us this good life he makes for us. We pass this down to our children, and they will pass it down too. Well, I thought this was remarkable enough, but then Mr. Escher took me to the back of the back room, and sitting on the bar was this nice reproduction of the Daniel Chester French statue of Lincoln that sits in the Lincoln Memorial, you know, the one where he's sitting. He told me he'd bought it 30 years ago and put it on the bar, and since then, our business only go up, never go down. But I noticed, I looked behind, and there was a plate of chicken satay and some rice behind it, and I asked him about it, and it turned out that every morning, Mr. and Mrs. Escher set out a meal for Lincoln in the restaurant next to his statue. He said, it's full meal, everything, entree, dessert, appetizer, drink also. We change the meal every day, so it's always different. We serve him everything. Everything but no pork. We do not want to be disrespectful. And I guess he saw my puzzled look, and he said, he is Abraham Lincoln, yes? Jewish people, they don't eat pork. Well, when a Thai restaurant owner in an Arab neighborhood builds a Buddhist shrine to a Jewish president, I knew that I was onto something special. Mr. Escher didn't use his shrine for commercial purposes, of course, but you can't go very far looking for Lincoln without running into the profit motive. This is America, after all, and Lincoln himself was a great believer in capitalism. But I bumped into this at the most unexpected places. When I was a kid, there was something called the Lincoln Heritage Trail, which I understand has been revived here in Kentucky. I saw some of it today, and it's a wonderful thing. But in the big Lincoln boom in the early 1960s, the three states of Illinois and Indiana and Kentucky got together to make this Lincoln Heritage Trail, which was nearly 1,000 miles long. And my parents took me on a car trip along this Lincoln Heritage Trail, and it's something that's just stayed in my mind forever. And so I got the idea, the Heritage Trail has fallen into disuse now, but I thought, you know, maybe I could piece it back together and figure out a map of it and take my own kids on a summer car trip to the Lincoln Heritage Trail, and they'd love it. And that was a serious misapprehension on my part, by the way. But anyway, I went about looking for information about the trail, and I couldn't find much anything. No one seemed to know how it had started or why it had fallen into disuse or how I could go about piecing it together. And I'd almost resigned myself to just giving up. And I got a call from Nikki Stratton, who is the head of the Springfield Visitors Bureau. And she said, I've got your guy. I've got the guy who invented the Heritage Trail in the early 60s. He put it together, and he's still alive. He's living in eastern Illinois, and he'd love to hear from you. He's in his early 80s now. And so I called him. His name was Robert Newman. He was a wonderful man and very happy to talk. But when I first called him up, I kind of, got a little over-enthusiastic, and I was waxing, and I was saying, it's such an honor to talk to you because, you put this trail together, and it betokens a time in the early 1960s when people really loved history. They loved Lincoln. They loved the idea of their own heritage. They wanted to go where he'd gone and walk where he had walked, touch the things he had touched, and it's just so inspiring, and I'm just very honored to meet you. And there was sort of a long pause, and he said, well, thanks, but don't you, that this whole thing was cooked up by the marketing guys at the American Petroleum Institute? And I said, no, I didn't. He said, yeah, they wanted to get people traveling, get them out of their living rooms, get them into their cars, buying gasoline. So apparently they had a whole series of these heritage trails. They had a George Washington Heritage Trail up the East Coast, and he said he put together a Hiawatha Trail up in Minnesota. And he said, well, that was hard because let's face it, Hiawatha didn't exist. It's only in a poem. And they had a really long one out in the West for the Wild West, and they had this one. And he said that before. The reason it was 1,000 miles long, actually 999 miles long, was because each state governor insisted that they have just as much as the other states. So even though Lincoln had fewer sites in every state, everyone got 333 miles, which is one of the reasons that the Indiana Speedway is on the Lincoln Heritage Trail from the 1960s. But Mr. Newman said something else that really stuck with me. He said, you put Lincoln's name on anything and you can sell it. And I saw all sorts of examples of this. I went to a seminar for businessmen that a company puts on out in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in which they fly in these CEOs and CFOs from big companies, Fortune 500 companies, and they sit there in a little hotel ballroom for a weekend and get lectured to about the leadership, the management techniques of Abraham Lincoln. Or as they put it, a learning platform for leadership behaviors. So I went and spent the weekend. I didn't find out what a learning platform is, but it was astonishing to see these men using Lincoln as a model as the ultimate capitalist. Lincoln was a terrible businessman himself. He had a number of ventures that winked out, as he said, and ended up being in debt for about 20 years. But I saw it also then when I started hanging out with some of these Lincoln collectors. I went from the very high-end ones to the very low ones.